No more pain, my ribs are broken, she whispered. Her voice cracked like dry earth in the sun. The wind caught the words and carried them across the emptiness, over the brittle grass, and toward a man who thought he'd buried his past with his gun. That day, beneath a blood-orange sky, he made a choice, and the West would remember it for as long as the wind remembered the dust. The evening was folding and slow and heavy, the kind of quiet only the frontier could keep. A dry wind rattled the warped boards of the corral fence, making the loose gate creak like an old mourner. The air smelled faintly of iron from the smithing he'd done earlier, and of sagebrush crushed under boot. Out past the fence line, the land rolled away toward a sawtooth line of canyon cliffs, each jagged tooth catching the last of the sunlight like embers in a dying fire. Eli Mercer moved with the easy, unhurried pace of a man who had no one to answer to. 55 years had turned his frame into something solid and unbending, carved by seasons of wind and work. His skin was leathered deep by the sun, his gray hair curling at the edges beneath a wide-brimmed hat. People in town called him a man who kept to himself. They didn't know, or they'd forgotten, that once upon a time he'd been the kind of man whose name made others swallow hard before speaking. He was setting the last of the feed sacks in the barn when it reached him, so faint he almost thought it a trick of the wind, a sound that didn't belong in the rhythm of the land, a half-broken whimper. He froze, his head tilting, eyes narrowing at the direction it came from. There it was again, just enough to slip under his ribs like a knife. A voice, brittle and breathless, fighting to exist. He stepped out from the barn, scanning the line where the tall grass met the shadows of evening. She lay crumpled near the dry creek bed, a small figure folded into itself, one arm pressed tight against her side. Her dress was torn, the fabric filthy with dust and the pale streak of travel. Dark hair tangled across her face, hiding most of it, but he could see the bruising even through the mess. He crouched, his shadow falling over her, and the scent of blood, faint but metallic, met him in the cooling air. Her eyes fluttered open at his presence, wide with something more than pain, fear so sharp it seemed to hold her together when everything else was breaking. No more pain, she rasped again, voice barely a thread. My ribs are broken. Eli felt something shift deep in him, an old, rusted hinge creaking back to life. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, and she looked like she'd been running for days. He wanted to ask who'd done this to her, but the question hung dead on his tongue. He wasn't in the habit of taking on other people's burdens anymore. Still, he slid his arms under her carefully, and she gasped at the movement. She weighed less than she should have, her breath stuttering with each step he took back toward the cabin. Inside, the single-room space smelled of wood smoke and horses, a lived-in quiet. He set her on the narrow bed in the corner, the only place soft enough for her bones. I can get you water, he muttered, already reaching for the tin cup by the stove. She drank in tiny, shaking sips, eyes darting toward the window like a hunted thing. They'll find me, she said suddenly, the word sharper now, cutting through her exhaustion. They'll come. He didn't ask who. He could see them already in the look on her face. Men without mercy, the kind who rode hard and didn't leave survivors if it suited them. Eli straightened, walking to the doorway, scanning the horizon. The sun was almost gone now, the sky deepening to bruised purple, but out there, miles away, something moved. Dust rose in a thin, steady column, too narrow for a storm. Horses. The sound reached him before the sight did, a distant, low thunder that made the boards under his boots hum. He let out a breath through his nose, slow and quiet. In the fading light, they were still just shapes, but there was no mistaking the way they rode. Purposeful. Hunting. His fingers found the edge of the doorframe, knuckles whitening as he gripped it. He'd spent years telling himself he was done with this kind of trouble. He'd buried the past with a Colt revolver in a locked trunk under the bed, the same way you bury a rattlesnake you hope will never come back to life. Behind him, the girl shifted, wincing, her breathing shallow. Please, she whispered, not even looking at him. The word wasn't just for him. It was for anyone the wind might carry it to. He closed the door and crossed the room, crouching beside her again. You got a name. Her lips moved like the name cost her something. Clara. All right, Clara, he said quietly. You're safe here. Safe. He wasn't sure he'd used a word in years. Outside, the sound of the riders grew stronger, the rhythm of their hooves steady as a heartbeat. Eli stood, his body moving before his mind caught up, walking to the old chest at the foot of the bed. The key was still on the nail behind the stove. He unlocked it, the hinges groaning open, and there it was, the black, worn grip of the revolver, the steel darkened by years and firelight. His thumb traced the cylinder like he was remembering an old song. The riders crested a ridge in the distance, 7 of them, black against the last spill of sun. They were close enough now that the evening wind carried their laughter. The sound didn't match the land. It was jagged, ugly. Eli holstered the gun, the weight of it settling against his hip like it had never left. He stepped out onto the porch, the board sighing under him, and watched them come. The West had a way of making men into ghosts before their time. He'd managed to stay alive this long by keeping to the shadows. But tonight, with a blood-orange sky fading behind them and a broken girl under his roof, the shadows wouldn't do. Far out on the plains, one of the riders raised a hand in greeting or warning. Eli didn't move. The past wasn't just calling. It was riding straight for him. The wind had gone still, but the quiet was worse than the noise. It pressed in on the cabin, made the walls feel too close, the air too thin. Eli stood near the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light, watching the dust on the horizon spread and settle like a slow-coming storm. Behind him, Clara shifted in the bed, her breath sharp with pain. She tried to sit up, failed, and lay back with a soft groan. The lamplight caught her face, drawn pale, and marked with bruises that told their own story. "They're called the Brant Gang," she said suddenly, her voice carrying more fear than volume. 5 brothers, and 2 more who ride with them. They take what they want. She swallowed hard. They took me. Eli didn't turn, but his jaw worked slow and tight. He'd heard the name before, years back. The Brants had a reputation even in places where no lawman dared ride. Men who could turn a town into a graveyard before sundown. They came to our ranch, she went on, the words halting heavy. Pa tried to stop them. Her voice broke. She bit her lip until it bled, shaking her head. They said I'd fetch a price in Durango. I jumped from the wagon when we hit the flats. Kept running until, she glanced toward him, until you found me. Eli turned from the window at last. Durango's a long ride from here. I know, she said, her eyes glistening. I thought I could make it. Guess I was wrong. For a long moment, he said nothing, only pulled the curtain across the window. In the dim, his face seemed carved from shadow, the lines deep and unmoving. She studied him as he crossed to the stove, the way his shoulders stayed square even when there was no one to impress, how he moved with the quiet precision of a man who'd lived a life on edge. "You're not just a rancher," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. The fire popped in the stove, sending a warm glow across the room. "Not anymore," he said finally. That was all. But in those 2 words, she heard a whole history. Gun smoke and dust, nights spent under strange skies, and the kind of choices that leave a man living alone at the edge of the world. Night fell hard. The air outside turned sharp and cold, carrying the faint jangle of distant tack. Somewhere out there, horses moved slow through the dark. Eli killed the lamp and stood in the stillness, listening. "Stay down," he murmured, stepping past the bed. He opened the door just a crack. The moon was thin and high, washing the land in silver. Far off, a flicker of movement caught his eye, shadows shifting where they shouldn't be, breaking the straight lines of the fence posts. The Brants weren't in a hurry now. They were circling, sniffing out their quarry. One of the shapes dismounted, crouching low in the grass. Another stayed in the saddle, scanning the cabin with the lazy arrogance of a predator who knows the mouse has nowhere to run. Clara's hand gripped the blanket. "They're here, aren't they?" "Not yet," Eli said, though it was a lie. She was silent for a moment. Then, "You could turn me over. They'd leave you be." "That's so." He shut the door softly. "Thing about men like that, they never leave you be. You give them what they want once, they come back to see what else you'll hand over." Her eyes found his in the dark. Why risk it? For me. He didn't have an answer he liked, so he gave her the truth. Because I've been on the other side of it. I've seen what happens when no one stands up. For a while they listened to the quiet. But out there, the gang was making themselves known. Slow hoofbeats circling, the occasional whistle between riders, a laugh that cut through the stillness like a blade. Then came the shouts. They started with the neighbor's spread, a small light in the distance. Hooves thundered past, dogs barked, and a man's voice shouted before being drowned in the clatter of boots on a porch. A woman's scream carried on the wind, short and sharp before it was silenced. Eli's hand curled into a fist. The Brants were sending their message. He moved to the corner, where an old chest sat under a tarp. Pulling it free, he knelt and worked the latch. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools he hadn't touched in years. His revolver, a box of cartridges dulled with time, and a leather belt scuffed by 1,000 draws. Clara's eyes tracked him as he laid the gun on the table, running a rag along the barrel. "You were a lawman?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not exactly." The truth was murkier. Once, he'd been faster than most and willing to prove it. Some called him a bounty man, others worse. The killing had been clean, or so he told himself. But clean or not, it never washed off. He pulled open the box of cartridges. Some were corroded, but most looked sound. He thumbed each one into the cylinder with deliberate care, the clicks of metal on metal sharp in the hush. Outside, the gang moved off into the distance, but not far. He could hear them at the edge of the property line, voices low, plotting their next pass. Clara shifted, wincing as she tried to sit higher. "They won't stop." "No," he agreed. "They won't." She watched him buckle on the belt, the weight of the revolver settling against his hip like it had been there yesterday. "Then what are you going to do?" He met her gaze, his eyes steady but carrying the shadow of something old and heavy. "I'm going to give him a reason to wish they'd stayed in Durango." The words hung in the air, quiet but certain. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Brants laughed again, but the sound didn't reach him the way it had before. The decision was made. The past was no longer buried. It was riding again, and this time it would meet them head-on. Dawn came thin and blue, the kind that made the world look washed clean and unforgiving. Eli had Clara on a pallet he'd lashed to a sway-backed mare, the travois runners whispering over grass and sand. The air bit at their lungs, cold as creek water, and every step seemed to ring against the quiet as they left the cabin behind. He didn't look back. A man didn't measure his chances by what was comfortable. He measured them by ground and light. Hollow Creek lay 2 hours north, where the land pinched into a stone throat, and that was where he meant to let the West test him. They reached the mouth of the pass as the sun climbed and set fire to the high rock. Cottonwoods trembled along the water's edge, their leaves flashing like coins, and the creek itself stitched silver through a bed of sand and flat stones. Basalt shoulders lifted on either side, scarred and pocked with old puma dens and storm-cracked shelves. Good cover for a lonely defender who knew how to make one rifle sound like many. Eli eased Clara down behind a shoulder of granite kissed with yellow lichen. She caught her breath through her teeth, one arm wrapped around her ribs. "I can do more than lie still," she said, and the way she said it told him arguing would waste time neither of them had. "You can see more than I can from here," he answered, pointing to a notch in the rock where the pass bent. "Watch that break. If you catch a glint before I do, touch my shoulder. No shouting, no waving, just that." He fished a small mirror, polished tin really, from his pocket and set it in her palm. "Sun's ours this morning. Flash once if you see movement, twice if they split." She nodded, sweat standing at her hairline though the air was cool. "They'll come fast." "They'll come proud," he said. "Pride's a short rope in a narrow place." He went to work without flourish. From an old coil he'd carried on the mare, he strung wire low where Willow's shadow crossed the trail, horse-knee height, hidden by leaf and light. He took a bag of square nails and drove 4 into a plank he'd scavenged, then wedged that board just beyond the wire in a scatter of windfall leaves. A stumble and a puncture, not enough to break a horse, enough to scare it mean. He set 2 lengths of rawhide across the higher ledge and anchored them to a dead branch balanced on a fulcrum of stone. One tug on the line, and the branch would roll loose, sending a clatter of rocks onto the westward flank. Not to kill, only to make men raise their heads and forget where their hands were. From his saddlebag he drew a dented coffee pot, a length of baling wire, and 3 old spoons. He wired them to a scrub of rabbit brush at the tightest turn. A body brushed past, and the spoons would chatter a warning bright as a bell. He sprinkled a thin ribbon of lantern oil on a stretch of creek with a water lap shallow. A single spark would lay a veil of smoke across the gap. Clara watched all of it, her eyes catching on each small cruelty of design. "You've done this before," she said, not a question. "Too many times," he answered. He took the Winchester he'd kept wrapped in an oiled shirt. He hadn't touched it in years, yet his hands remembered the weight, the throw of the lever, the smooth cradle of stock to shoulder. He laid it behind a slab of rock, shaped like an anvil, and checked the sights. Beside it, his revolver, loaded and reloaded until the rhythm of cylinder and click slowed his heart. The pass breathed around them, a living thing, murmured water, a hawk's thin cry, the tick of heat beginning to walk the stone. He settled into a hollow scraped by flood and time, his body disappearing into angle and shadow the way a lizard learns a wall. Clara lay with her cheek to the rock, eyes trained on the notch. "You asked last night why I'd risk it," she said, voice a quiet thread. "Why did you leave whatever you were? Why stay alone out here?" He kept his gaze on the trail, watching light move, and not trusting any of it. "Because I learned I could draw faster than my reasons," he said. "That's not a thing to be proud of. A man keeps at it long enough, and he stops simple mistakes with graves. I wanted to see if the wind could wear me down to something gentler." She let the words sit, no judgment in her silence. A minute later her fingers touched his shoulder. One tap. He nodded and raised the Winchester an inch, not enough to catch light. The notch darkened, the color of moving dust, sidewinding low. 2 taps, they'd split. They came the way hungry men do when they think the meal is already theirs, laughing in pieces, their edges unbuttoned. 4 riders in the cut proper, 3 dragging wide along the ridge to take comfort from height. Sun flashed on a buckle, a ring, a rifle barrel. Eli marked them without thinking, breaking them down into bits of habit and horse. The Brants wore their meanness like a uniform, long dusters hanging ragged, hats pulled cruelly low. The 2 who weren't kin had the broad chests and bored eyes of men who rented their rage by the day. The leader rode center, reins in one hand, a black neckerchief coiled under his jaw. He stood easy in the stirrups as he drew near the bottleneck, and even from a distance Eli could see the cocky slant to his shoulders. A Brant sure as the noon bell. The Brants loved a crowd and a clean line of sight. Hollow Creek would give them neither. "Clara," the man's voice rolled into the rocks, all syrup and threat. "Sweetheart, we're tired of the game. Come on back, and nobody else gets pinched." Eli let the pass give his voice back to them, the echo shaping his words into something larger. "Turn your horses." Simple, kind almost, like directions to a traveler who'd lost his way. The leader twisted in the saddle, squinting at rock and light. "Who's that?" He laughed like a saw through green wood. "You some neighbor with more opinions than sense? We'll find you. We'll bring you out by your heels if we have to." Eli touched the rawhide line and gave it a slow pull. Stones cascaded down the west wall in a clack and tumble, a sudden clap of thunder that sent the ridge riders wrenching their mounts away. The leader's horse skittered, ears flat, and in that little hop Eli sent a single round ringing out. The bullet took the knob of the man's bandana clean and flicked it into the creek. No harm to skin, plenty to pride. Silence fell strange and quick. He worked a lever. The sound carried, oil smooth, efficient. A man who knows that sound knows exactly what it means. On the high flank, one of the hired guns, broad-shouldered, a nick across his chin, muttered something Eli didn't catch, but he heard the shape of fear in it. "Which Brant?" Eli asked the morning, as if he were reading from a ledger. "The one with the wolf's tooth on a thong, Saul? Or Orrin, who favors his left when he drinks?" He spoke their names like they were coins he'd carried too long in his pocket. By the time they left Hollow Creek, the sun was slanting low and the heat had bled out of the day. The air smelled of wet stone and trampled grass. and the creek's voice grew smaller with every turn in the trail. Clara lay back in the travois, her eyes half shut, the blanket drawn to her chin. The worst of the fear had gone from her face, leaving behind something quieter, fatigue. Yes, but also the first thread of trust. Eli rode ahead, his old bay moving at an unhurried walk. The Winchester was wrapped and strapped again, the weight of it resting easy. He kept scanning the far ridges, but the Brants were nowhere to be seen. They'd been humiliated, and that kind of wound didn't heal quick. But for now, the land was his alone. The trail home bent through stretches of wind-blown sage and dry grass that whispered under the hooves. Here and there, a meadowlark flitted up, its song too bright for the long shadow the day had left. The light went gold, then amber, then began to cool into the purple of evening, the kind that makes a man feel like the world might hold its breath a moment longer than usual. They crested the last low rise before town. From here, Eli could see roofs and the straight, dusty ribbon of Main Street. Even at this distance, he could feel the eyes waiting. He hadn't been a name in this town for years. Now it seemed the name had come back ahead of him, riding faster than the bay ever could. By the time they reached the edge of town, the word had spread. People stood in doorways, hats low, eyes sharper than they had been that morning. Some nodded. Others looked away like they didn't want to be caught staring. He recognized a few: storekeepers, the blacksmith, two ranch hands from a spread farther out. And though no one said it outright, the air carried that electric charge that comes when a story has already been told 3 times before the man in it arrives. He didn't stop. He led the mare through the main stretch and turned east toward his land. He felt the weight of their eyes until the town fell behind, and the sound of boots on wooden walks faded into the long hush of the open plains. Back at the cabin, the day's work was already written in the scuffed boards and dust on their boots. He carried Clara inside, setting her carefully in the bed she'd left only that morning. She tried to smile. "You didn't have to bring me all the way here. I could have stayed in town. Someone would have. Someone might have." He cut in gently. "Or they might have sold your name to the Brants before the sun was down. Here, they'll have to ride through me first." Her gaze searched his face for something, proof, maybe, or the thread of reason behind a kindness she couldn't name. "You don't owe me anything, Eli." He didn't answer right away. He unbuckled the gun belt, set it on the table, and opened the chest at the foot of the bed. This time, the revolver went inside and the key turned in the lock. Then he took the gun belt and hung it on a nail above the mantel, the steel catching the lamplight. It would gather dust there until the day someone came who made him take it down again, if that day ever came. When he sat on the edge of the bed, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Long time ago, I had a shot at stopping men like the Brants. I didn't take it. Cost a friend his life. Been living out here ever since, trying to get the sound of that moment out of my head." He met her eyes, steady now. "Today wasn't about owing you. It was about finally putting something right." Clara didn't speak. The fire popped in the stove, the only sound between them. At last, she reached for his hand and squeezed it, her grip weak but warm. "Then I guess you did." Outside, the sky bled into full dark. Stars came in handfuls at first, then spilled in waves until the whole dome was freckled with light. Eli stepped onto the porch, leaning against the rail, his hat in his hands. The land stretched out in every direction, wide and unbroken. The night air was cool against his face, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the dry sweetness of prairie grass. Somewhere out there, the Brants were nursing their pride and counting their grudges. He knew they might come back. He also knew the West didn't forget days like this. Word would ride faster than any horse, carrying the story of Hollow Creek into saloons and bunkhouses and campfires until it grew its own legs. The truth would shrink and stretch depending on who told it, but the bones of it would stay the same. He turned back into the cabin, the door closing softly behind him. Clara was already asleep, her breathing even for the first time since he'd found her. The lamplight washed the room in gold, catching on the revolver above the mantel, making it gleam like a memory half buried but never gone. The plains beyond the cabin had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. And as the wind moved gentle through the grass, carrying away the last echoes of the day, The story was already settling into something more than fact, something that belonged to the wide, hard country itself. Some say the West was too wild for Mercy. But on that day, Mercy carried a gun, and it stood alone.